Think about the map of the United States for a second. We all know the order in which the states joined the Union. We know Delaware was first, then Pennsylvania, and so on. But what if I told you that the political timeline of America has absolutely nothing to do with the biological age of the people living there? A team of researchers recently decided to ignore the history books and look exclusively at the genetic clock ticking inside the residents of the original 13 colonies. They used a massive database of over 2 million DNA samples to calculate something called the genomic arrival age. This doesn't measure how long a person has been alive, but rather how many generations a specific genetic signature has been rooted in a specific piece of soil. They ranked every founding state from the youngest DNA to the oldest, and the results have completely flipped our understanding of American migration. We've always been told that New England is the ancestral home of the country, the place where the oldest roots reside. But when the data came back, the state at the top of the list, the one with the deepest, most ancient genetic timestamp, was a place that historians usually overlook. It's a state that wasn't famous for huge arrival ports like New York or Philadelphia, yet its people carry a biological signature that is older than the United States itself. Today, we are going through the rankings to see which states are home to the newest Americans and which one holds the crown for the deepest genetic heritage on the continent. To understand the concept of DNA age, we have to look at the way genes behave when a population stays in one place for a very long time. When a group of people settles in a region and remains there for centuries, their DNA begins to develop unique endogamic signatures. These are small, recognizable patterns that act like a biological GPS. In the United States, because we are a nation of immigrants, most of our DNA ages are relatively young. For someone living in a place like California or Nevada, their DNA might only have an arrival age of 2 or 3 generations. But in the original 13 states, researchers found pockets where the DNA age was 10, 12, or even 15 generations deep. As we move down the list of the 13 states, we start to see a massive divide between the states that stayed put and the states that kept moving. Starting at the youngest end of the ranking, we actually find New York. This might come as a surprise given that New York was one of the very first settlements, but the reason for its low DNA age is its own success. Because New York City has been the primary gateway for the world for over 200 years, the old genetic signatures of the original Dutch and English settlers have been almost entirely diluted. Every time a new wave of people arrived from Italy, Ireland, or Eastern Europe, the average DNA age of the state was reset. When scientists look at a random resident of New York today, they see a genome that is incredibly diverse but biologically shallow in terms of its residency on that specific land. It is a state of constant newcomers, which makes it culturally vibrant but genetically young. Moving up the list, we see states like Georgia and New Jersey. These states have a slightly higher DNA age than New York because they have large rural areas where families have stayed on the same farmland for a century or more. However, they were still heavily influenced by the massive internal migrations of the 20th century. People moving from the north to the south for air conditioning and jobs in the 1980s and 90s brought younger DNA into the mix, pulling the state's average down. This is the paradox of a growing economy. The more successful a state becomes at attracting new residents, the younger its genetic heritage becomes. The DNA is a record of stability, and in America, stability is often the opposite of growth. As we reach the middle of the pack, we find the New England states like Massachusetts and Connecticut. This is where the shock started to set in for the researchers. We've always been taught that the Mayflower and the early Puritan settlements created the ultimate old American lineage. And while those lineages do exist, they are no longer the dominant force in the DNA age of those states. The massive industrialization of the late 19th century brought in so many new workers that the ancient New England DNA was pushed into small, isolated pockets. If you go to a place like Boston, the DNA age is relatively young. You have to go deep into the mountains of New Hampshire or the coastal villages of Maine to find the old signatures, but there aren't enough of them to lift the state's overall ranking. The Mayflower DNA is famous, but in terms of the total population, it's a drop in the bucket. Now we get into the top 5, and this is where things get truly interesting. At number 5, we have Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a surprisingly high DNA age because of the Plain people and the rural Quaker lineages. Groups like the Amish and Mennonites have stayed in the exact same counties for nearly 300 years. They marry within their own communities, which preserves a very specific, very old genetic signature. When scientists sequence the DNA of a resident in Lancaster County, they aren't just seeing a person. They are seeing a biological map of an 18th century German village that hasn't changed its genetic structure in 10 generations. Pennsylvania would be even higher on the list if it weren't for the massive young populations in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh balancing it out. At number 4, we find South Carolina. South Carolina has a unique genetic history because of its geographic isolation during the 18th century. Rice and indigo plantations created a very stable, albeit very difficult, social structure where people didn't move much for hundreds of years. The researchers found that in the coastal Lowcountry, the DNA signatures of both the European and African-descended populations are among the oldest in the country. Because these communities were isolated by swamps and a lack of major roads for so long, their genetic clock was allowed to tick in place without much outside interference. This is a recurring theme in the study. The harder it was to get to a place in 1700, the older its DNA age is today. Number 3 is Virginia. As the site of Jamestown and the birthplace of the Southern colony system, Virginia has a reputation for old roots. The data backs this up. Virginia's DNA age is boosted by its Tidewater families. Even though Northern Virginia is now a hub of international business with young DNA, the rest of the state is anchored by lineages that have been in the same zip code since before the American Revolution. The researchers noted that Virginia has a specific Chesapeake signature that is almost never found in people whose ancestors arrived after 1800. If you have that signature, your family hasn't just been in America for a long time. They've been in that specific slice of forest and shoreline for the entire duration of the nation's history. At number 2, we have Maryland. This was the first major surprise. Why would Maryland have older DNA than Virginia or Massachusetts? The answer lies in the religious history of the state. Maryland was founded as a haven for Catholics, and for a long time, the Catholic gentry of Maryland stayed very tight-knit. They didn't move west with the pioneers, and they didn't migrate to the big cities of the north. They stayed on their estates and farms, passing down land and DNA in a closed loop for over 2 centuries. Maryland represents a genetic anchor. Even as the world changed around them, the core DNA of the state remained remarkably unchanged. Finally, we get to the number 1 spot, the state with the oldest DNA age in the entire 13 colonies. And when the researchers saw the name, they had to run the numbers 3 times to make sure it wasn't a mistake. The winner is North Carolina. Now, why is North Carolina the genetic grandfather of the United States? It's not the oldest colony by date. That's Virginia. It's not the most famous for its founding fathers. That's Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. But North Carolina has a secret ingredient that preserved its DNA age like a time capsule. It was known as the graveyard of the Atlantic and had almost no deep water ports. For the first 200 years of its history, North Carolina was incredibly difficult to get to and even harder to leave. While people were arriving in New York and Pennsylvania and then immediately heading west to Ohio and Kentucky, the people who settled in the North Carolina backcountry stayed put. Historians used to call North Carolina a vale of humility between 2 mountains of conceit, referring to its more famous neighbors, Virginia and South Carolina. But that humility led to incredible genetic stability. The people who settled the Piedmont and the Appalachian foothills in the early 1700s, mostly Scots-Irish and Highland Scots, built communities that functioned almost like islands because there were no major cities to attract new immigrants and no easy way to ship goods out. These families lived in a state of self-sufficiency for generations. They married the neighbors, they farmed the same land, and they passed on their DNA with almost zero outside mixing for nearly 250 years. The DNA study found that North Carolina residents have the highest homogeneity of origin of any of the founding states. If you meet someone from rural North Carolina today, there is a statistically high chance that their DNA age is over 200 years. This means that if you could trace their family tree back using only their genes, you would find that their ancestors were living in that same county before George Washington was president. This level of biological continuity is almost unheard of in a country as mobile as the United States. It's a place where the founding DNA didn't just arrive, it took root and refused to move. But there's another layer to North Carolina's number 1 ranking. It's not just the European DNA that is old. The state is also home to some of the most ancient and stable indigenous and multiracial DNA signatures in the country. Groups like the Lumbee tribe have a genetic signature that suggests a deep, localized ancestry that spans dozens of generations in the same region. Because North Carolina's geography allowed for hidden communities to survive in the swamps and the mountains, these old signatures were protected from the great waves of displacement and migration that modernized the DNA of other states. North Carolina is a patchwork of these genetic time capsules, all contributing to a statewide average that is older than any other state in the Union. What does this mean for the shocked historians? It means that our understanding of heritage has been skewed by who wrote the most books. We talk about the Pilgrims and the Dutch traders because they left behind the most paperwork. But the DNA suggests that the true core of the American genetic experience was happening in the quiet, isolated hills of North Carolina. It reminds us that history isn't just made by the people who are moving and shaking the world. It's also made by the people who stay, the people who build a home, stay in it, and create a lineage that lasts for 3 centuries are the ones who truly define the biological character of a region. The researchers also noted that this old DNA age is a disappearing resource. As the Research Triangle in North Carolina becomes a global hub for technology and medicine, hundreds of thousands of new people are moving in every year. They are bringing young DNA from all over the world. In another 50 years, North Carolina's ranking will likely plummet as it becomes as diverse and genetically young as New York or New Jersey. We are currently witnessing the final decades of this 300-year-old genetic epic. The oldest state is finally catching up to the rest of the country. This study changes how we look at the concept of a founding state. Is a state defined by the date its politicians signed a piece of paper? Or is it defined by the people whose ancestors actually cleared the forests, built the towns, and survived the hardships of the frontier? If we use the DNA age as our metric, the oldest America isn't in a museum in Philadelphia or a harbor in Boston. It's in the quiet, rolling hills of North Carolina, in the blood of people who might not even realize they are walking around with a biological signature that hasn't changed since the days of the King of England. The ranking of the 13 states by DNA age is a reminder that we are all walking around with a history we didn't write. Our genes are a record of where our ancestors succeeded and where they struggled. They are a record of the choices they made to stay, to move, to marry, to survive. When we look at a map of DNA age, we aren't just looking at science. We are looking at a story of human persistence. We are looking at the people who didn't give up on their land, even when it was hard to live there. This study also opens up a lot of questions for other states. What would the DNA age be for a state like New Mexico, where some families have lived in the same villages since the 1500s? How does the old DNA of the Southwest compare to the old DNA of the East Coast? While this study focused on the original 13, it's clear that the American story is much older and more complex than the 1776 start date we learn in school. We are a continent of ancient roots that have been overwritten by a very fast-moving modern world. The results that shocked everyone aren't just about North Carolina being number 1. They are about the fact that America still has these hidden, deep-rooted pockets at all. In a world of global travel and the internet, the idea that a genetic lineage could stay in one place for 3 centuries feels impossible, but the DNA proves it's true. It proves that the Old South and Old New England aren't just myths we talk about in history documentaries. They are physical, biological realities that you can see under a microscope. So, the next time you drive through a small town in the Carolinas or Maryland, look at the people around you. You aren't just looking at modern Americans getting their coffee or going to work. You might be looking at a living link to the very beginning of the country. You are looking at a DNA age that has survived wars, depressions, and the total transformation of the world. It's a silent, invisible megaproject of nature, the building of a family tree that is so strong and so well-rooted that it outlasts the buildings, the roads, and even the governments themselves. The researchers are now moving on to study the epigenetics of these old populations to see if living in the same place for 300 years has actually changed how their bodies respond to the environment. Does your DNA learn a piece of land? Does the soil of North Carolina or the climate of Virginia leave a mark on the way your genes express themselves over 10 generations? We are just beginning to scratch the surface of what the age of the DNA really means for our health and our future. But for now, we have the ranking. We have the data. And we have the incredible, unexpected reality that the deepest roots in America are found exactly where we weren't looking. Thank you for exploring this genetic journey with us. Whether your DNA is old enough to remember the revolution or young enough that you're the first in your family to be born here, you are part of the unfolding map of the American genome. The clock is ticking for all of us, and every generation adds another layer to the story. The oldest state might be North Carolina today, but the beauty of DNA is that it's always changing, always growing, and always ready to shock us with a new secret hidden in the code. We'll be watching the labs and the libraries for the next discovery that changes everything we thought we knew about where we come from and who we really are. Turn off the history books for a second and just listen to the science. It's telling a story that is far more amazing than anything we could have imagined.